I'm very interested today to share with you some theories and ideas that explain the way relations form, particularly between children and adults, and there are many implications for us in early childhood settings. Rather than one theorist, I decided to bring together the work of three different theorists, Donald Winnicott, Martin Buber, and Max van Manen. And these three people were extremely helpful in coming together under the umbrella of phenomenology. When we're talking about phenomenology, it's useful to think of what it does and how it can support us. What it does is it helps us examine everyday events in a very detailed manner, examining things exactly as they occur. And Max van Manen has a great way to explain this approach. He says that it's a helpful approach because what it does is to increase our perceptiveness and tactfulness. And he's very precise about those two things. And then he argues, and I would agree, that when you have these qualities, your approach to research has a great wholeness about it. Everything's taken up. A phenomenological approach assumes nothing, imposes, just watches, and it waits. It watches and it waits. It's still and it's careful. Everything is explored in a detailed and even, you can say, tender way. These detailed observations that we take become a springboard to clarify daily life and to tell us what's going on here, what's at stake, what matters. This clarification happens through a really rigorous process. It happens through a great deal of analysis, writing, examining and reflecting what we've written, and then looking at those ideas in relation to the theorists that we've been reading as we've been collecting our data. It's a very interactive and organic and exciting process. The findings that we have when we have a phenomenological study, these findings aren't neat little answers, and sometimes that can be frustrating. What the findings do is they indicate the infinite possibilities that are created through the lived experience. These profound moments that are difficult to explain are the moments that I call playing in the in-between. Much of our daily life involves other ways of operating, and Martin Buber, this is a reader of his work, a wonderful theorist who wrote a very small poetic book called I and Thou. He has some very interesting explanations about daily life. And what he says is that a lot of daily life is what we call I, it. And he sort of writes this in a funny way. It's capital I with a dash and then capital I for it. So it's I, it. And he says that these are times can be great collaboration, lots of things happening in an amazing way. Each person recognises the other, you sort of know what's expected. Sometimes those times of collaboration can be difficult. It can be a struggle for power, but very much you're there as an individual looking out at what's around you, and that's I, it. The times of playing in the in-between that I talk about are not like these I, it times. When I looked at Martin Buber's work, these playing in the in-between times linked very much with the times that he calls I, thou. So it's I and a dash and then thou. It's a funny way to write it. And he collects in this area all these other times, these times that are not marked in the same way. They don't have space. They don't have the same requirement for who we are and what we need to do. The complication, of course, is that if you don't have a set view of the entity of the other, your position as a subject isn't quite so clear. So when the time is finished, they don't have what we'd call a social biography. They don't have a social narrative. So afterwards, it's really difficult to actually work out what transpired there, what happened, was it important, could I tell it to someone else? And the answer is often no. It may seem from all this discussion that playing in the in-between is something that maybe we should put out a kit for or make sure it happens all the time. And Martin Buber again explains this beautifully. He says these times come when they're least expected and they vanish when they're tightly held. We can't have them and we don't want them all the time. It wouldn't be possible. They are in relation to those other I-it times of collaboration where lots of positive things are happening. A lot of our great intentional teaching happens during these times where we know one another, we know the circumstance. My ideas are that if we don't do a little bit more with understanding what I call these fundamental core moments of playing in the in-between, if we focus all our time on the I-it of life, the expected, the required, the needed, the intentional teaching, we sometimes lose the thing that can matter most to people, this core sense of being, this sense of really being included and cared for and loved by one another, and that time for some reason just vanishes. So what I did, I looked very carefully at this playing in the in-between, and then I said, well, yeah, this is okay, but in order for people to gain from this, we need to break it down. We need to see what's there, how does it work? And of course, the three elements that I share, they could be 300. These are just my little start in this process, and I'm sure many people, and particularly people working in early childhood, understand so much how this playing in the in-between works. And the job ahead is for people using all sorts of theories. They might use the ones I have, they might use other ones, they might use worldviews, they might use their philosophy, whatever people want to use to try and make sense of it. My encouragement, my great encouragement, is that people will examine more carefully and closely these wonderful moments that sometimes you could think, well, did they count much? Well, we can't explain it, we don't know it, because they don't have that social narrative I talked about, so they can evaporate a bit, and we sort of think, oh, well, was it so important? So in order to bring us to the importance of these times, what I did was to examine and look at them in relation to the real research and people involved in these. And I decided there were three pieces to my puzzle. The first was that you need to be fully present. In order to be playing in the in-between, you're 120% there. In fact, you're there so much, you've got no idea what's going on outside of you and the person with you. It's a wonderful circumstance. And it's not a fully present because someone's told you to be fully present. You are absolutely there. The second element, which is sometimes a bit harder to follow, it's to be there and fully present, but in a state of unknowing. That means that we're really right there for possibilities, all sorts of possibilities. And that unknowing that Martin Buber, but also particularly Max van Manen, has some wonderful things about stillness and a respect for one another, and that unknowing where you're not just suddenly jumping in and wanting to do 101 things. The third component that I argue is there is a state of mutuality through love. And love is such a big ocean of a word. What does it mean? So in my explanations, I think of mutuality through love, because particularly in early childhood, there is a great attention to mutuality. We have a sense of being with young children and their families. That means that mutual collaborations happen a great deal. So that mutuality through love is something that grows and consolidates and becomes better and stronger.
My area of research interest is in phenomenology, and most people have a hard time with just even the word itself, what that means. However, for me, phenomenology really comes down to some pretty basic concepts, and it's really for me about the experience that people have and how we make meaning of their experience in the world. So for me, with phenomenology, when we're making meaning, when we're living in the life world, or we're borrowing experiences from others in the life world, and we look back at it, we reflect on it, and we begin to make meaning of it. I hope that we can do that with research, with research subjects, folks we're working with, and not sort of look at it in isolation as this researcher who has this objective interest, but it's very subjective. It's very much about establishing rapport and having a relationship with people sort of in an ongoing way, so that actually what we can do with the experience as we're making meaning is we can change our lives. And that's really the hope that I have in my particular research and the work that I do in schools with teachers and young children. I'm also very interested in phenomenology in my own participant research. So as I'm having an experience in a classroom with a teacher and with children, such as my latest research endeavor, where I'm looking at young children and teachers' experience in the theater, and how they make meaning out of acting and drama and play in a theater, in a children's theater, not like some sort of city theater, that kind of thing, but directly inside of a school, where we might have a stage and some props and some things to play with light and music and sound and that kind of thing. That I also am having an experience myself, and I recognize that as a researcher. So it's really important for me to also express my own experience out into the world and make meaning of that alongside of or along with children and teachers.
Actually, I've traveled a circuitous journey in my attempt to understand where I need to go. My initial doctoral training was in behavioral psychology, and I found it intensely uncomfortable. I was sitting in an autistic clinic, the most famous one in the US, with a clipboard, taking interval samples of children's behavior and watching adults squirting lemon juice into children's mouths to try and make them behave. They have since evolved from lemon juice now to wearing helmets that they can give them shocks with remote control. It really frightened me a lot, and the instrumentalization of children was contrary to everything in my being. I then shifted to sort of cognitive ways of understanding, and I was really taught to think about children as thinkers and think about the child's life as a life of thought, but not thinkers in an imaginative way, but really in a cognitive way, narrowly defined. And then I discovered cultural difference, and I became interested in the cultural texture children bring to their lives, but I still didn't have a way of really putting it all together. And I trained as a psychoanalyst, and in the process of training in psychoanalysis, first of all, I journeyed inward, and much of my writing since then has been autobiographical. In fact, I did a book where I appear as a 6-year-old on the cover in a photograph, and I've been really journeying to understand myself, because I think self-understanding is the key to the capacity to work authentically with others. You take away some of the layers of your own assumptions and go deeper. And since then, I've been using psychoanalytic theory to do two things. First of all, it's really sensitized me to working directly with children. And there are a number of wonderful theorists from France and from the Tavistock Clinic in London that have been powerfully influential for me in understanding how to be in the presence of a child. A great Canadian writer who wrote a book in 1986 called The Tone of Teaching, his name is Max van Manen, and he has some lovely essays on the phenomenology of childhood. And he talks about how every child needs to be seen. And I think this is a big lack in our schooling, that we really don't truly see children. And in fact, this ties in with Lacan's idea of recognition and misrecognition. Misrecognition is profoundly harming, and recognition is the act of meeting somebody in an existential way, sort of like Martin Buber would say in the I-thou relationship. And then I found also that, especially when I went to Lacanian theories of psychoanalysis, that not only did I get insight into the inner life of the child, but it also gave me tools for working with the cultural, since Lacan says that the unconscious begins with language and the symbol system. We're caught in a paradox with subjectivity. Essentially, I can't become me unless I enter the symbol system of a society. An autistic child who refuses to enter symbols remains autistic. Figuring out how to hold on to the possibility of creativity and authenticity when you're becoming alienated by becoming who you are is really a complex and difficult issue. And that's what I found psychoanalysis most helpful for, especially those psychoanalysts who tied language, culture, history, and ancestry into it and didn't just treat it as a thing within the head. And the psychoanalysis that has been justly criticized, I think, is one that treats it as what we call intrapsychic and doesn't acknowledge context. And context for me is very important.
So for me, the origins of phenomenology in my research practice come through what I actually like to refer to as the anti-bias education that I sort of got involved in Portland with my elders from kind of my early days. So what happened is I became really interested in the life experiences of others in our area, especially as children would come into my own classroom as a teacher and their parents would come in and we'd want to have these dialogues and conversations where we would open up really tough subjects, like when I would have, say, a two-mom family, like lesbian family, coming into the classroom, and I had another family whose dad, the mom was interested in our school's philosophy around building relationships with people who are different from us, but the dad didn't want to do that, and so he would have this challenge about, I don't want you teaching my child about these gay parents, and I would say, well, that's what we do in our school. That's who we are. That's how we live together. And for me, that lived experience became so critical as a way to not only articulate a story or tell a story about people's lives. So I sort of attach phenomenology to the narrative and the way we tell stories about ourselves. But I also then think we make meaning through those stories in a way that's very critical for others to be able to see and feel and touch the lives of those around them. So that's really the beginnings, the origins for me of kind of understanding how we make meaning in the experience and of people around us.
When I talk about playing in the in-between, and the three components of being fully present, mutuality through love, and unknowing, I think about the kind of theoretical support that I've had from the three theorists I've mentioned already, Max van Manen, Martin Buber, and Donald Winnicott. And when I first started my work, I looked at the kind of theories and theorists that were available, and those theorists have given us a lot, such as Piaget and Vygotsky and Michel Foucault. Their work is great at explaining a number of aspects of the social contexts, with Foucault's work on struggles of power and Piaget's work looking at children's development, and all those theorists contribute. The interesting aspect I found with those theorists when I looked into them and wondered about their usefulness in my own work was that those theorists require a clear entity. The people that are involved are clear in the jobs they have and the things that they're doing. And when you look carefully at those theorists and others, you can find that their ideas can be tracked back, I argue, to the work of Hegel. Interesting ideas where, as Hegel argues, each person looks at the other, requires the other, in fact needs the other to observe, but underneath there is a feeling that observation of the other person that you need so desperately can in fact destroy you. So this struggle for power is explained very well through Hegelian logic. That's a very profound and good explanations, and the work of Hegel helps us in understanding, as I was mentioning before, intentional teaching and ways of working together. That Hegelian logic wasn't helpful for me in trying to make sense of these profound moments, but such simple times that come and go, as we know, as Buber says, come when we least expect and vanish when they're tightly held, when you want those moments all the time. So that was what encouraged me to look for another theoretical framework through phenomenology, and particular people. We keep saying the word theorist. I mean, what does it mean? These are people that have put together some arguments and some ideas. I suppose my encouragement is that people play around with these views and these positions and these arguments. And I very much like the way Andrew Metcalfe and Anne Game, when they write about theory and talk about these things, they say we need to be careful not to all the time think about theorists and theories as something that we must serve, and that if you move out for one moment out of one theory, you're going to miss an idea. And in fact, the kind of explanations that they provide are beautifully explained in a book of theirs called Teachers Who Change Lives. And those of you who are interested in following through the way we can understand alternatives to Hegelian logic, they explain these in a very useful way. And again, I argue in a way that's particularly pertinent for us in early childhood education. Now, why do I say that? I say that because a lot of the work we do is focused on and is about enabling these profound moments of playing in the in-between to evolve so that the child, not just the child, the adult involved, feels included, feels like they belong, and in the terminology of being, belonging and becoming, all those things can be coming out of this circumstance of being comfortable with yourself. And there's another really important component to all of this that we see in good early childhood programs, that sense of being authentic, being yourself no matter what, being absolutely fully present because you're holding a baby in your arms, enabling and working with a toddler to do something special. And one of the examples I have is a mother and her 2-year-old son washing his hands, just a simple thing and can be easily missed. But in this case, the mother went to trouble to give her boy a box so he could stand. It was quite a stable little box, and it enabled him to be able to not just be with his little hands over the edge of the basin, but he could stand at the basin. She then gave him a cake of soap and put the temperature of the water on so that it was just right. And he stood there feeling the soap, feeling her hands, feeling the water, and without either of them saying anything. She wasn't asking, what shape is the soap? How does it feel? Is it slippery? They didn't need any words. The sounds of his pleasured noises just there, washing his hands in a simple, happy moment where he could stand. He wasn't having to be held by that adult in any way at this young age. This is the sort of example that I saw when I worked for years in early childhood centres. It's the example that I was part of, but I didn't understand it because, as I argue, it doesn't have a social narrative. It doesn't have a biography. So I couldn't go back and say, oh, I was doing all these wonderful special things in early childhood education, and that was the benefits. I couldn't understand the benefits. So in many ways, my ideas of playing in the in-between, and even coming to wonderful theorists like Donald Winnicott and Martin Buber, have come from many years of working with young children, understanding the profound beauty of these times, but not quite knowing what it was I was part of. And then as an early childhood educator, a lecturer, looking at students and then graduates doing these things. And the process for me, this long process, was to understand more about the way relations form, because I argue they form in these special, tender, easily missed moments. And these are the moments in early childhood education that we are fantastic with. We know how to do them. We know that they're important with other things, but in the past we haven't had, if you like the term, theory. We haven't had a framework where we could put it up and say, well, I'm actually taking time here this morning touching these flowers and putting them in a vase because I can feel with this child and with myself that there are some really relaxing, authentic circumstances that will be very important, maybe even more important, can we say, than the child actually knowing the colour and the shape of the leaf. The child feels something has transpired, and when that child rushes to their parents when they come to collect them and says, look, I put these flowers in here, and maybe it's such a young child they can't even use those words. The teacher knows, the child knows, and there is a sense of absolutely being together, playing in the in-between. And I really encourage all of us to think of these ideas and many others as starting points, springboards. Take them where we want to. Work around with them. One of the pleasures I've had over the years is working with Denise Proud, and she reminds me all the time that these things can't be boxed up and identified and ticked off. Oh, I've done such and such now. These things come from our heart, and together with our understandings become a blend of things that for young children are so vital.